Welcome back guys for another Warhammer Imperium Wednesdays video. This week I'm showing you how to paint the container from issue 14. Now doing something a little bit special with this container. I'm painting it in a Grimdark, chipped, very worn and battered container so that it fits in with my armies. So this isn't your usual clean, tidy container. I will show that in next time we get a container, just for video purposes. But this time I wanted to show you how I'm doing it. So I've gone ahead and primed the model with a black primer. In this case it's Chaos Black. And I'm now brushing over a couple of coats of Dryad bark. And what this is going to do, this is going to be my undercoat rust effect. So what I'm essentially doing, or the way that I'll be doing this, is painting over the model with basically making it look really rusty. I'll then apply the chipping effect that I'll be using, and I'll show that obviously in the next step. And then I'll paint my container colour over the top and then remove the chipping effect, which will leave these rusty chip effect over the model. So first of all, like I said, I'm going to get all this Dryad bark on here, and then we can move on to the next step of the rusting effect. Right, so once I've got a few coats of the Dryad bark on there, I've now got this deep sort of rusted brown look. I'm now using a very old and beaten dry brush, or basing brush, whichever one this is, from Games Workshop, and some Ryza rust. And as you can see, I am literally dabbing it over the model to create rust. Now I'm removing the excess just as I go off camera there. I don't want any thick blobs going on this. If you do, then you can carry on dabbing over that area and it will remove them down. What also happens is you can see it's a little bit faded. It doesn't go on fully opaque. The brown shows through the rust a little bit, which gives us one tone. And then a little later on, you can go back over this once you've gone through the model, and using a little bit more paint on your brush, add in a few random areas with a little bit more paint, and that will leave the brighter orange look, and you can get basically two tones from the same colour. You'll get this slightly faded look, and then over the top you'll get a more orangey look. And you can also do the same if you keep, a minimum amount of paint on the brush and stipple it back over where you've already done. Once it's dry, you'll be layering up and it will become more opaque anyway. So I'm going to get on, do this around the whole container, and then we can come back for the next step. Right, so once I've got this fully rusted container look, now obviously if you want a fully rusted container look, there you go, job's done. But obviously I want to give it a bit of a chipped effect. So what I'm now applying is a gloss varnish. This is the technical Ardcoat from Games Workshop. You could do it with a matte varnish, but I find the gloss varnish works a little bit better for the chipping effect. So I'm applying this obviously by brush. If you want to do it by airbrush or aerosol, anything will work. Just get a good coat or two of varnish on there, as something that we'll be using later on is going to remove the paint if there isn't varnish on there. So this just gives it a bit of extra protection. So then obviously you want to leave it for about 10 minutes to dry before moving on to the next step. But I'm going to go ahead, get this painted on here, and then catch you back once it's dried. Okay, so now for my chipping effect cheat. Now normally you can go out, or people recommend going out and buying a chipping medium, such as the one sold by Green Stuff World and Vallejo and companies like that. They cost about £2.50 to £3 for I think it's a 17ml bottle, something like that. But as you can see, I'm just using PVA glue. Now the idea with the chipping effect fluid is you would paint it over the whole container, let it dry, paint your main colour over the top, let that dry, and then with a bit of water and something like a toothbrush or, you know, just a rough brush, go back in and add in chips. Perfectly fine way to do it. This is just an alternative if you haven't got chipping fluid, if you don't want to pay the price for a small bottle of chipping fluid. You can get a huge bottle of, you know, a 200ml bottle of PVA glue for £1. The only difference is you can see here I'm having to apply it by brush in the areas where I want the chips. You can't use this like a chipping medium and paint it over the whole thing, as when it comes to the later step to removing it, you'll end up removing the whole lot. So you kind of have to paint your chips in. Now I'm using a 2-to-1 ratio of PVA glue and water with this as an experiment. I recommend going neat with PVA. The water tended to want to retract on itself and go into more of a blob refined shape, whereas neat PVA doesn't. It stays where you put it. It doesn't sort of retract back into itself and make a smaller blob. You have a bit more control for it, which is how I did it on my one of my Nurgle Death Guard models, but I thought I would try it differently for the container, and I can tell you neat PVA instead of thin down PVA, you will get a better result. So yeah, basically apply it where you want your chipped bits to be. You know, you can get a pretty good shape. You can go small bits with a little bit of PVA glue on the brush, and obviously a larger area with thicker blobs. Now the bigger blobs will resist the paint that is going to go over the top. You're not going to remove it with your brush. The smaller ones can tend to peel away a little bit more. So obviously it's a compromise between cost and effective use, but I wanted to show you the PVA way. So I'll go ahead, get this on all over the container in the areas that I want it, let it dry for about 20 to 30 minutes, let it fully dry, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, so once the PVA has fully dried for about 30 minutes, I'm now going in with a large soft brush and my main colour. So my main colour for this container is going to be green, so obviously I'm going with the Caliban green. Now the reason I say a soft brush is a firm brush is going to remove the PVA glue. Even though it's dry, it's going to pull it off before we want to. Now PVA glue is water soluble, which means it dissolves really easy in water. So the other thing you have to be mindful of is not to thin down your paint too much. I would recommend a 3-to-1 paint to water ratio and no more. I know for some people that may be a little bit too thick for painting, but if you use a soft brush and stipple it on like this, you will actually get a thin layer. You can see I'm just about getting coverage with this. You can still see that rust. It does take about 2 or 3 layers, which is what it would normally take if you were brushing anyway. The only difference, because I'm stippling, I'm not going to be rubbing off that PVA glue. Like I say, the PVA glue is a good trick. It's cheaper. If you haven't got any chipping medium lying around, then you can give this a go. Chipping medium obviously is a little bit more resistant to brushing. If you have an airbrush, then PVA glue is going to be perfect because you're not going to put any pressure on that glue. So yeah, get a good couple of layers down, get it nice and opaque, and then we can move on to the next step. You do again want to leave it to dry for about 20 minutes to make sure that the paint has fully dried, because when we start applying the water to dissolve the PVA, obviously you're going to end up removing the paint if the paint is still a little bit wet, if it hasn't fully set. Okay, so once that top layer of paint has dried, I'm now taking a firm brush. This was a makeup brush that I've cut the bristles down in half, and it makes them much firmer towards the bottom. They're still a little bit soft. They're not going to scratch into the paint. But when you dip them in water, or dip it in water, and you can see I'm now scrubbing over the paint, it's breaking down that PVA glue. and with a little bit of firm pressure, you can do this with any brush that has just some stiff bristles, but with a firm bit of pressure and some scrubbing, you can see that the PVA glue starts to break down and come away, leaving us with a half decent chipping effect. Obviously the chipping effect is going to vary depending on how much PVA glue you applied, where you applied it and such. So again, the chipping medium does give that benefit of when you're going over with a brush, it's going to chip where you then want to chip. You apply the chips. This way is like the reverse to that. You're pre-applying the chips and then just removing that medium, the PVA glue, afterwards. Now the reason it's going foamy is because the water is mixing with that PVA glue, so that's how you know it's working. It foams up. Not a problem. You just use a damp paper towel and sponge, dab over the top of it, and you'll remove the foamy bubbles. It goes a little bit green because obviously you are removing a little bit of the paint, especially what's over the PVA glue. That's breaking down and mixing in there, so that's why it goes green. That's not the paint that you're removing off the model, that's just the paint that is on top of the PVA glue chipping effect. So again, I'm going to go around this whole model and remove the PVA glue, then give it a little bit of a rinse down with a clean brush, clean brush and paper towels, and dry it off and that, and then we can come back and have a look at what we get. So once you've removed the PVA, this is what you get. Now I went in with a toothpick and added some scratches, which is what you can see there. Just again as an experiment. This is more of an experiment video so you guys can see what I've ended up with, rather than a do this, it's great kind of thing. You can see what my mistakes were and decide whether or not you want to go with this effect or the chipping medium. My next video that I do on a container, I'll do it with the chipping medium so you can see the difference. And the third one, I will show you guys how to do just a clean, nice painted container. But yeah, I wanted to show you the PVA trick first, and then we'll do the chipping medium next time. But all I'm doing now is using some Necron compound, just any kind of silver metallic paint, and an old brush, and just adding in scratches that basically haven't rusted yet. So these are going to be sort of more fresher scratches. Barely any paint on the brush, on the bristles. I'm just applying it to especially the under area here, where it's going to come in contact with the ground and lower surfaces more, it's going to get rusted up, especially the feet. It's going to get chipped up a lot more. So yeah, this is just more of a metallic chips that haven't rusted. So yeah, there we are for this step. Right, so now that the container is essentially finished, I'm just going in with some Xandri dust and painting over the two skulls in the consoles, the one at either end. The reason I'm doing this in a bone colour is in the 40k universe they like to use real skulls for like servo skulls and things like that. So I thought, well, this one's got an eye lens where the eye would be. It looks like a skull. I'm going to make it a human skull. It's a real skull that's been modified into the console. So keeping it nice and simple, I'm not doing any super highlights. It's a terrain piece, doesn't need to be brilliant. So yeah, just some Xandri dust over the top. I'll then use some Mephiston red and get that into his eye lens and onto all of the buttons underneath the skull. So that each of those little dots and then the bar at the bottom of it, and that will be it. That's all that's needed for this step. And then once that's done, you can either shade in the skull if you want to put a bit of shading in there. You can leave it how it is and you have a perfectly fine finished container. If you want some shading on there, you can throw some Agrax Earthshade or something over the top. But for this next portion of the video, I'm using techniques that are a little bit more advanced, not so beginner friendly, I would say. You can do it as a beginner, it's not a problem, but I would recommend using Agrax Earthshade as a wash instead of the effect that I'm going to be using next. But if you want to see what I do, keep watching the video, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so as I mentioned, this next part I would say is not so beginner friendly, in the sense that we are using some chemicals. Now I'm using here Streak and Grime from AK Interactiv and a regular brush, and I'm going to apply this over the whole model. Streak and Grime is an enamel paint. It's a solvent based paint, which means you can't mix it with water, you can't thin it with water, and you can't clean your brushes in water. And this is where the not so beginner friendly part lies. It's a great paint, it's great product using enamels, especially for effects. It's what we used to use years and years ago, back in the late 80s, or back in the 80s and the early 90s, before acrylic paints were really a big thing. We used enamels, and a lot of realistic model makers, you know, like the World War tanks and things like that, they use enamel paints compared to acrylics. They tend to use enamels a little bit more. Anyway, as you can see here, like I said, I'm using Streak and Grime and applying this over the whole model. Now, to clean the brush, you need to use white spirit, and that's what I mean with the extra chemicals. It's not child friendly. If you're under 18, then I recommend sticking with either acrylics, or if you're going to use this, make sure that you know what you're doing, that you wear some sort of paper mask or face covering, because it can be quite fumey. Have a window open nearby. You want to make sure the room is ventilated. These fumes can make you very dizzy. Now I'm using here what is called low odor white spirit. I think you can get low odor terps and terpenoid, things like that. Just make sure that it is low odor, but it does still have an odor. It will still make you dizzy if you are not in a well ventilated area or have some kind of breathing protection on. And what you do is, I've poured some into this jar that you can see I've got here. It's an old jar of it. You can constantly reuse white spirit, you know, multiple times. You can transfer the liquid to another jar, leaving all the sediment in the bottom. That's a little bit more of a technique that I can explain in a later video if anybody wants to know how you do that. But yeah, anything that comes into contact with enamel will need to be washed off in low odor white spirit. But anyway, I'll get all of this on, and then we'll come back to the next step. Now I'm not going to let this dry fully. Basically I'm going to apply it on and then rinse my brush off, and then I can move on to the next step, starting back where I first started and then working around the model in the same order. But we'll get to that in the next step. Okay, so now that I've got the model coated in this, you can see here I'm using a cotton bud. Now this is a bit of an unusual cotton bud. It's more one that is designed for makeup removal and stuff like that. So one end has a point to it, and the end that I'm using here has a flat end. The alternative to this obviously is the type that people use for their ears, even though you shouldn't, just the round-ended cotton buds. Or you can use a makeup remover pad that looks very similar to this, but it uses a plastic stick with sponge or foam on either end instead. Usually cost about £1 for 20 to 25 of them. So yeah, and all I've done is dip this into the white spirit just to soak up a little bit of white spirit onto the cotton pad, and you can see now I'm just basically gently going over and removing a lot of that grime. Now what this is going to do, because I'm not pushing too hard, I'm bouncing over those surfaces, so where you've got like the crossbars, it's going to leave that grime within the vicinity of that bar like a wash would. But unlike a wash, this is going to stain the surface a little bit more, giving it a bit more of a grimier, dirtier look. So all I'm going to do, like I said, with white spirit, go around this whole model and remove the cotton bud off the end. But no, remove the streak and grime from the majority of the model, leaving it in those recesses, leaving it up against those edges and sort of step ups and you know, gradations and stuff within the model, and leaving a little bit on the surface here and there just to get a grimy surface look. I'll then set that aside for about 10 to 15 minutes to fully dry. White spirit evaporates, and as it evaporates, obviously the enamel then sets in. So yeah, leave it for about 10, 15, 20 minutes to let that enamel then set. Once you've wiped it, get rid of all the alcohol, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, so now the majority of the streak and grime is used, or removed, sorry. I'm now using a very thin brush. This is a liner brush. It's a bit more of an artist's brush. It's a very long but thin end to it. I'm dipping this into the neat streak and grime, and as you can see, I'm just drawing lines. This is going to act like grime and, you know, rust and stuff that is running down the sides of the container, so I can apply this where I want and try to get thin lines. If you get some slightly thicker lines, you can rinse this brush very quickly in some white spirit, and with the white spirit still on the bristles, you can touch down the line on either side where you want it to fade off and not be so harsh, and essentially thin the line and run the line down, and you'll get varying gradients of varying thickness of grimy streaks. Obviously you can apply this as and where you want all over the container, it doesn't matter. Just obviously try not to do it over the top. With this I would say less is more, but yeah, just think of where the grime would sort of sit and collect and then run down the container. So obviously you're not going to want a huge amount sitting on, or you're not going to want any kind of streaks on the top of the container, just on the sides, but you can do sort of like pools and stuff like that around the top of the container in areas where it may collect. Right, so once the grime is done, I'm now using rust streaks. Again, it's very similar to the streak and grime, but it has a slightly more orangey, brownish hue to it rather than that dark grimy brown. And again, I'm going to apply it in the same kind of fashion, but more from where rust would collect, so around bolts, sort of corners where rust or water would collect up on that rust and then sort of wash down. Obviously this is the effect you get when rain washes onto rust, removes the deposits within the rain, runs down the container and tends to evaporate, and it leaves these rusty looking streaks. Hence the name, rust streaks. Again, little is more, so try not to overdo it with this. And if you find that you've put it on too harsh or you want to remove it, just a little bit of white spirit on a cotton bud and it will come off nice and easy. And now finally I'm using Crusted Rust Deposits. This is the medium one. aka Interactiv, they do 3. They do light, medium and dark, I believe it is. And the difference is basically they get a little bit more from brown to more of an orange. So this one I only have the medium. I'm just experimenting with this. I hadn't used this product before, and basically this is to give more of a heavy rust deposit where that water hasn't been able to move so much, and it's lifted up the rust and then settled, and yeah, it just tends to look a little bit more orangey in those places. And again, I'm just going around a few areas applying this, like I say, areas where water is going to collect a little bit more. I do a few streaks here and there, but for the most part it's just yeah, that heavier rust deposits. Okay, and there we have it, guys. So once the enamels have dried, I've gone ahead and given this a coat of varnish. I do recommend this as enamels can leave a little bit of a smell behind on them. So yeah, I just applied the varnish over the top and let that dry. But yeah, that's the finished container. Obviously you can go in and do up the lights if you want. You can change where you can put metallics, and some people do the little eagle heads in golds and things like that. But just for a basic rusty container, there we go. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. If you have, please hit that thumbs up button. Leave any feedback. If you have any comments, suggestions or questions, drop them in the comment section below. If you haven't yet subscribed, then please help the channel grow and hit that subscribe button down there. If you have recently subscribed, then a huge warm welcome to the inner circle to you. But that is it for now, guys. So until next time, take it easy and keep painting those minis.